All right, brethren, this morning is going to be a bit of a shift of gears from what we've had the last several weeks. I want you to go to the book of Hebrews. Pretty certain that Aaron and Manny are still going to close out 1 John probably in the next 2 weeks, maybe one more sermon than that, but I was reading Hebrews, and I just felt so much excitement and encouragement about the things that are said concerning Jesus in this book. And I was out praying this morning, and I was thinking to myself that sometimes it happens where you're trying to prepare to preach and you just don't find a lot of direction or encouragement in any particular way. And I always come to a conclusion in my mind in those periods to preach something about Christ. And it always seems as though the Lord opens my eyes to something about Christ. And it was no different here as I started to prepare this week. So what I've done, I've kind of put this little mini series together that I'm going to start today and then continue for the next few times that I preach. And it's all going to be out of Hebrews. Now, let me just tell you, I'm not going to preach the whole book. I'm not going to go through it verse by verse, kind of how we've done in 1 John. But what I'm going to do is I want to consider a few of the different themes throughout Hebrews, but particularly themes concerning the person of Jesus. And really that's because from chapter 1 in Hebrews all the way through chapter 10, there's 13 chapters in this book. And chapter 1 through chapter 10, there is really rich and deep theology concerning Jesus. And there's actually a really important reason why this is the case. And I've already mentioned this when we've been dealing with 1 John, but there's actually a lot of similarity between Hebrews and what is happening in 1 John. The Christians to whom Hebrews is written are Jewish Christians who are being persecuted because of their faith in Jesus as the Messiah, and they are being tempted to go back to Old Covenant Judaism. It's a very similar issue that we see in 1 John. And so this author writes to these Christians for the same purpose that John writes his letter to those Christians, and he exhorts them to abide and to remain in the confidence they have in Jesus and the confession that they have in Jesus. So that's his conclusion to the whole thing, that they remain in that confession, that they remain in their confidence in Jesus. But the way that he gets to that conclusion, the way that he ultimately is able to encourage them to do that, to maintain their hope in Jesus, even though they do find themselves in persecution, is by using the first 10 chapters of the book to exalt Jesus in 4 very important ways. Now, as I go through this is going to be pretty heavy theologically. And it is necessarily going to be so because the book of Hebrews is almost all theology about Jesus. This isn't light stuff. This is heavy theology being written to these believers so that they would understand who Jesus is. And it is deep theology, brethren. So we got to focus here as we consider some of this. We're going to be reading a lot of passages through Hebrews. But here's the idea. Like I said, in those first 10 chapters, the author is going to exalt Christ in 4 very important ways. The first one is that Jesus is said to be the Son of God. And as a son, he is worthy to be worshiped because his position as a son, and as a very unique son, is superior to all others. He holds a superior position as God's son. That's going to be the first argument laid forth. The second thing is that Jesus is shown to be a greater high priest. You know, the high priest in the Old Testament, they offered the sacrifices. Well, Jesus is portrayed as a better high priest who can truly intercede for his people. The third thing is that Jesus is said to be a mediator between God and man in a new and better covenant that God has established. And this covenant is actually capable of bringing about the promises that it offers. It brings fulfillment of those promises. And then the last thing is that Jesus is portrayed as a better sacrifice than the sacrifices of the Old Testament. A sacrifice which can finally and fully really cleanse us from sin. So these four arguments are presented to these Christians in a way it is intended to show them over and over again that what they have with Jesus is far better than anything that they would have back in the Old Covenant. If they return, as we've looked at in 1 John, if they return back to the shadows of Judaism, they would lose all that is offered in Jesus. And he really wants to make it, brethren. The idea of abandoning Jesus to go back to the shadows as an impossibility. That these Christians could never even imagine such a thing. And that's his intent. And so ultimately, I want to consider each of these four arguments brought out by the author. But each of them are going to require way more than I can cover in one message. So today, basically, we're going to look at an overview of all four of them. I want you to see the arguments as the author lays them out, but I want you to see how they're all connected. Because these are not four random ideas concerning Jesus that are thrown out. Oh, we'll use these four and see what they can do. These are really intricately connected with one another. He is making an argument here concerning Jesus, and each point builds upon the other. And I want you to see how all of that works together. In fact, throughout the whole book, even though there are four distinct ideas put forth about Jesus, right? That he's his sonship, his priesthood, his mediatorial role within this new and better covenant, and his better sacrifice. Even though there are four distinct ideas, they are so much blended together. They're so much blended together, in fact, that as the author moves from one argument to the next one, the thing that it reminded me of as I was reading it, and maybe this is, we got the Olympic thing going on right now, so maybe nobody's watched that, and this is maybe not the best example, but you've all seen like a relay race that has happened in the Olympics or maybe in another place, right? Where you have the runner runs, and as he's about to pass the baton to the other runner, the guy just doesn't stand still. What happens is the next runner actually begins to run before he has the baton, and he had his hand out back this way, and the other runner catches up to him, and so the whole thing kind of flows in a movement. And this is kind of what's happening in Hebrews. As the author moves from one point to another, he already starts the argument of the next point while he's still making the argument of his previous point. Everything kind of flows in this singular direction, and one thought spills over into the next thought. And so this is very much connected. These are not four random ideas, like I said, and I want you to see how they all work together in this whole argument of Hebrews. So we're going to see how all these four work together in this glorious exaltation of Jesus. And then, as I preach the next few times, we're going to come back and examine each one of those four arguments in individual messages. So again, we have a lot of passages we're going to be reading. This is very deep theology concerning Jesus. If you have not read the book of Hebrews already, I know you guys are studying Hebrews, so hopefully this is a help to you guys as you consider it. But if you haven't read this book, I would really encourage you to go and read it. Number one, this will make more sense as we start going through it. But there's just glorious things here, brethren. So that first, let's consider this first one, right? An overview of these arguments. The first one is that the author is going to begin to paint this portrait of Jesus in chapter 1, and he's going to do so by portraying him as God's unique Son. And as God's Son, like I said, he is superior to all others. And he is specifically shown in the context of Hebrews to be superior to the angels and superior to Moses. Now, both of those are really, really important in regards to first century Judaism. And let me explain to you why. The reality is this. At this time, you had three distinct sects of Judaism. You had the Pharisees, you had the Sadducees, and you had a third sect of Judaism that often doesn't really get explained, which was the Essenes. This was another sect of Judaism. And it's interesting, through the New Testament, there's actually a lot of criticism towards the view of the Essenes, but we're not that aware of it because we don't really know their theology that much, at least in terms of like modern Christianity. However, there are Jewish historians that have written about these different perspectives of these Jewish people at this time, and Josephus gives a lot of information, not just about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and what they believed, but also about the Essenes and what they believed. And just a few things for you, and maybe you will notice that a lot of this stuff is discussed in the New Testament. But the Essenes, a big part of their theology, they had a disdain for marriage, and a lot of times wouldn't allow it. They would shun any type of pleasures in life as vices. They had all types of asceticism and rigorous practices to the body. They had very strict rules about rationing food and how you could eat and what you could eat and that kind of thing. But there was another practice that they had that is really important in regards to this. They would worship angels. Twice per day. Sorry, hold on a minute. Twice per day, in the morning and at night, there would be rituals and prayers performed regarding the angels. And Paul actually deals with this in the New Testament. In Colossians 2, you don't have to go there, just listen to this real quick. He says, "Let no one disqualify you, insisting on asceticism and worship of angels," going on in detail about visions puffed up without reason by his sensuous mind. So this is dealt with in the New Testament. And it is really important in regards to Hebrews because the author wants the readers to understand the supremacy of Jesus in relation to the angels. And so he goes at this right away. He starts in verses 1 and 2, and he speaks about how God has spoken in times past in many different ways, but now he has finally spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed to be the heir of all things. The sonship of Jesus is what is going to make him superior to all others. And notice what he says here in verse 4, chapter 1, verse 4. It says, he's speaking about Jesus, he says that he has become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. What is the name that Jesus has inherited? Son, right? This is the idea that is being portrayed here. You could think of that as title, potentially. But the idea is that Jesus has received this name of Son. And because he's received that name, he is superior to the angels. And in contrast, notice what the author says about the angels in chapter 1, verse 14. He says, "Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation?" So the idea is they are not sons as he is, but they are servants. In fact, the way you could even translate this is they are serving spirits sent out to serve. That's what they are. In fact, in 1:6, the author speaks of the angels and their response to the Son, showing his supremacy. It says, "And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he says, 'Let all God's angels worship him.'" So the case is clear here. Jesus is superior to the angels. He's going to say a little bit later in chapter 2, verse 9, that he was made lower than the angels for a little while. But now he is crowned with glory and honor. But this is not the only case, again, that the author is trying to make in regards to the supremacy of Christ and his sonship. He has now made clear that Jesus is exalted above the angels. But there was another person in Judaism which was the subject of great reverence. And it was, of course, Moses. Moses was considered the greatest prophet in all of Israel's history. Moses' word was God's word. Moses' law was God's law. And Moses was no doubt a faithful servant of the God of Israel. But the author is going to exalt Jesus above Moses because of his role as God's unique Son. Look at what it says here in chapter 3, 1 and 2. He says, "Therefore, holy brothers, you who share in a heavenly calling, consider Jesus, the apostle and high priest of our confession, who was faithful to him who appointed him, just as Moses also was faithful in all God's house." But notice what he says in the following verse. "For Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses." Now that is an astonishing claim. Jesus worthy of more glory than Moses? I mean, did anyone have more glory than Moses? We're talking about a man who had to cover his face as he came down from the mountain because he had such glory. But notice what he says here in chapter 3, verse 5. "Now Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant to testify to the things that were to be spoken later. But the Messiah is faithful over God's house." How so? As a son. So here we get back to this point again, right? Jesus, as God's Messiah, as God's unique Son, his position is by nature far superior to Moses. And so what would be the conclusion, right? If you're reading this, what's the conclusion? The idea is, listen, if you listened to Moses, the servant, you have far more reason to listen to Jesus, who is the Son of God. Moses was one of those prophets that spoke in times past, as the author says there in chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. But God has now spoken through someone of infinitely higher position. his very own Son. And so this is the first case made by the author. The Jesus of Hebrews is the unique Son of God, and as such, far superior to Moses, the greatest prophet of God, and far superior even to the angels, these powerful spirits who serve the purposes of God. Jesus reigns supreme above all others as God's Son. That's his first argument. But then he's going to build on this. The second thing taken by the author is to display Jesus as a greater high priest. And again, brethren, this is really fundamental in terms of Old Covenant Judaism. In that system, the high priest is responsible to deal with the sins of the people. He was the one who could enter into the holy place and make atonement for their sins. The high priest was truly, in some ways, the hope of the people. Brethren, if the high priest failed to do his job, the people would have no assurance of the forgiveness of their sins. And so the high priest is this mediator between God and man. But the author wants to show Jesus to be a better high priest, a greater high priest than any of the priests of Judaism. He is the only one who can deal with our sins in the way that they truly need to be dealt with. He is the only true mediator between God and man. And like I told you, these claims about Jesus are not clearly separated. He kind of blends these points together. And long before the argument of Jesus as the supreme Son of God is brought to a close, we already get hints and points of connection with Jesus being the high priest, the greater high priest. He actually already begins to address Jesus as a high priest as early as 2:17. He says this, "He had to be made like his brothers in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God to make atonement for the sins of the people." And then he does it again in 3:1, when he refers to Jesus as the apostle and high priest of our confession. But then it kind of goes away. The high priest thing goes away all the way until chapter 4, verse 14, when it comes out again. And this is really when the baton is sort of finally passed to the next point. Look at what it says here in 4:14. "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession." And again, like I said, this is where finally the argument now moves fully into the argument of Jesus as a greater high priest. The author has already made the case that Jesus' sonship makes him supreme above all others. And now he wants to make it clear that this Son, the very unique Son of God, now stands as a priest between God and the people. And listen, there's going to be so many things that are said about Jesus and his priesthood in this, and I can't even deal with half of what's going on here at length. But we will. We're going to come to it. We're going to deal with it. But I want you to just consider a few brief things in regards to what is said here about Jesus as a greater high priest. The author is going to compare Jesus to the high priests of old. And what he's going to do is he's going to talk about how there are some ways in which Jesus is similar to those priests, but there are other ways in which he is very dissimilar to those priests, and therefore much greater. Now, two of the similarities that he brings out are that this new high priest is able to sympathize with us, just as the high priests of Judaism were able to sympathize with the people. This is going to be a similarity. And another one is that Jesus is similar to the other high priests in his appointment as a high priest. That the appointment is by God. That people don't make themselves high priests, that God appoints people as a high priest. And this is going to be another similarity that's brought out. But you got to remember, brethren, in these similarities, he is going to show some great dissimilarities in an attempt to show how much greater Jesus is than the other priests. So think about this first one. That Jesus is able to sympathize with us as a high priest, just like the priests of old. Look at what we're told in chapter 4, verse 15. He says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses." Jesus is fully capable of understanding what it is like to be us, to be human. And it's very similar to the priests of Judaism, the priests of old. Notice what he says concerning those priests. Look at chapter 5, verse 2. He's speaking of the old covenant priests. He says, "He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness." So the Jewish high priests, the other priests, they're like their brothers also. They're capable of dealing gently with the people, because those people deal with the same things that their other Jewish brethren deal with. But there is a major distinction between the two. Even though they're similar in that they can sympathize with the people, what is the major distinction brought out concerning this high priest? Do you know what it is? Different than the other ones? Sinless. A major distinction. And it can't be overlooked, brethren. You know what? The Jewish high priests, they were able to sympathize with their brothers because they were like them in that they were also sinners. Look at what he says in chapter 5, verse 3. "Because of this, he, the priest, is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people." But in regards to this greater high priest, he has no sacrifice to offer for himself. He has no need to offer a sacrifice for himself. You know, we're told there in 4:15, we already read part of it, but we're told there that he can sympathize with our weaknesses and understand us because he became like us. And even, as it says there, that in every respect he was tempted as we are. And yet, quite importantly, brethren, it says, without sin. This is certainly a greater high priest. You know why? Because if he doesn't have to atone for his own sins, how much greater surety do I have that he can atone for my sins? But then there's a second similarity between Jesus' high priesthood and the high priesthood of those in Judaism. And this similarity, again, as I already mentioned, is the fact that no high priest is able to anoint themselves to be such, but that they are appointed and anointed by God to be such. Look at what it says here in chapter 5, verse 1. He says, "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God." Now look what he says in verse 4. "And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God. So you can see he's already setting up this point. And notice how he connects it to Jesus in the following verse, right? So he says in verse 5, so also the Messiah did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, today you are my son. You are my son. Today I have begotten you. And as he says also in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Now, that's the similarity, right? No priest anoints themselves. The old covenant priests, God anointed them. Jesus, he's the same way. Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was made one by God. And listen, there is so much involved here in terms of what is happening with Jesus' priesthood, and I don't have time to deal with all of that. But the point that the author is going to make is to consider the greatness of Jesus' priesthood and its total distinction from the priesthood of old. Jesus is said to be a priest. It says here, after the order of Melchizedek. We're going to deal with this at length when we deal with this in its own separate message. But this character, Melchizedek, is an Old Testament figure. He was a priest, and you can go back and read about him in Genesis 14. But Melchizedek was a priest in the Old Testament. Long before the law of Moses came, and long before the laws of who was supposed to be a priest ever existed. And yet this man was a priest of God. And the point being made about Jesus being a priest after the order of Melchizedek is saying that Jesus is a priest in the same manner or the same way as Melchizedek. Jesus' priesthood stems from the same company or association as the priesthood of Melchizedek. And you have to know this. It is distinct. It is separate from the Levitical priesthood, which was the priesthood established by the law under the Old Covenant. Those were the people that offered the sacrifices, the Levitical priesthood. And this is different than that. This is totally distinct from that. And this is going to be part of his point. The argument is going to be that Jesus holds a greater priesthood. But not just that he holds a greater priesthood, but that he received that priesthood from an entirely different source, in an entirely different way. Let me ask you a question. Under the Old Covenant, this might be a complicated question to answer, but under the Old Covenant, how did someone become a priest? The answer is actually simpler than you might think, but how does one become a priest under the Old Covenant? Any thoughts? That's it. That's exactly it, brethren. You became a priest because you were born of the tribe of Levi. End of story. If you were of the tribe of Levi, you were a priest. You couldn't enter into it. You couldn't opt out of it. You were in it by lineage, by heritage, by descent. And this is going to be a point made by the author of Hebrews to show how different the priesthood of Jesus is. Jesus received his priestly status by a sworn oath from God, not by physical lineage. Notice what he says here in chapter 7, verse 15. He speaks of another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek. Now notice, who has become a priest. How did Jesus become a priest? He says, who has become a priest not on the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent. That's exactly what we just said. It's exactly what Giovanni just said. I almost said Javier again. It's exactly what Giovanni just said. Heritage, right? Physical descent. And yet he says here comes another priest on the scene who does not come by the basis of legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him. Now notice what is said next. This is the sworn oath from God. You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek. This oath from God, brethren, has to do with the permanency of Jesus' priesthood. He is a priest forever, not temporary. He is a priest forever. And this, brethren, is going to be the basis of the argument for the author of Hebrews why Jesus' priesthood is so much superior than the other priests. He doesn't die. He holds his office forever as a priest. Brethren, even if you had the greatest high priest you could possibly have under the old covenant, two shortcomings will always remain. They will have their own sin that has to be dealt with, and eventually they will die. Even if you had the best high priest, the most holy man of God you could imagine, eventually he dies. And what has to happen when he dies? You need another one, right? You got to replace him. You got to put somebody else in his position. And so the conclusion is that you would be an absolute fool to consider returning back to the old covenant priests when you have this glorious priest available to you who stands as a perfect individual, who never sins, and one who never dies. He never has to be replaced. He always stands to make intercession for his people. And his atonement for their sins never ceases. And so the second case is made. Jesus is a greater high priest than those other high priests. Now the following point is going to be that this greater high priest, this Son of God, stands as a mediator of a better covenant. A covenant which brings about the things promised. And again, this point enters in before our author comes to the close of his previous point, as he's in the midst of that argument in chapter 7. Look there with me, chapter 7, verse 21. Here, he's speaking of Jesus as this priest and how he became a priest by an oath, right? And he states that oath, the Lord has sworn he will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. So he's in the midst of this discussion about priesthood. And then he says this in 7:22. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. Well, what's interesting is he immediately goes back to the priesthood stuff. In verse 23, the former priest, or many, he's back into the priesthood stuff again. The baton is not really fully passed to the next point until chapter 8, verse 6, when he concludes his point concerning Jesus' priesthood and enters into this discussion about Jesus as a mediator of a better covenant. Look at what he says here in 8:6. He says that Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. Jesus' ministry, or his service as a high priest, is far superior to that of the priests of old. And the reason is, brethren, because the covenant he mediates is far superior. Now, this argument is going to be the shortest of the four, but it's very powerful nonetheless. He's going to show that that previous covenant, which we will eventually come to see as the covenant with Moses, that covenant was not capable of producing what it promised. But the thing is, that's not really an issue, because that was actually built into the design of that covenant. It was never intended to be the final thing. That covenant, with its laws and regulations, it was only intended to be temporary. And Paul makes this point over and over again through the book of Galatians. You don't have to go there. Just listen to what he says here. Galatians 3, Paul says, "Now before faith came, we were held captive under the law, imprisoned until the coming faith would be revealed. So then, the law was our guardian until Christ came, in order that we might be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian." So it was intended to be temporary. And so what we see here in Hebrews is that this Jesus is the mediator of a new and better covenant. And this covenant was actually promised a long time ago by God in all sorts of texts in the Old Testament. Jeremiah 31, which the author of Hebrews is actually going to quote here shortly. Ezekiel 36 are two major places where God promised a new covenant. And because of the fact that God himself had promised this very thing, the author of Hebrews is able to use that as a point of argumentation. Look what he says here in chapter 8, verse 7. He says, "For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second." And then he's going to go on in the section there to quote directly from Jeremiah 31, where God had promised a new covenant long before it ever came to pass. And this point is pretty clear, brethren, right? If the previous covenant, look at what he says, right? I want you to think about this, right? He says, "For if the first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second." What's his point? What's the point? That there's something wrong, right? There's an issue here, right? If the first covenant was good enough, so to speak, if the first covenant could bring about all the things promised, then there would have been no need for God to promise another one. There would have been no necessity for it. There would have been no reason why the people would have been looking for another one. But God did make that promise of another covenant. And the people were anticipating another one. He speaks quite strongly in chapter 8, verse 13. He says this, "In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete." What does that mean? What does obsolete mean? No, obsolete. Yeah. Irrelevant. Right? Doesn't matter. It's going away. And that's what he says here, right? In speaking of a new one, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. This is a massive claim, brethren. A massive claim. The covenant that the Jews had received and lived by for the last 1,500 years or so was about to pass away. I mean, how could it be? Why would God even do such a thing? Listen, he's going to tell us. The author here is going to tell us in chapter 9. Through chapter 9, he speaks about these different elements of the worship of the Old Covenant. And he's going to say this in verse 8. Verse 9. Verse 9, chapter 9, verse 9. He says that this is symbolic for the present age, and he says, according to this arrangement. Now he's speaking here of the Old Covenant and its system of worship. All that God had established there. So he says, according to this arrangement, everything that was there, he says, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body. Look, imposed until the time of Reformation. So the point is, brethren, this Old Covenant had an expiration date. God had promised another covenant. And it was only a matter of time before this new and glorious thing burst onto the scene. And what the author of Hebrews wants us to know is that this Messiah has finally appeared and has come to mediate this better covenant. Notice his conclusion in 9:15. He says, therefore, he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that, notice the purpose here, brethren, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance. Brethren, this is the great reality of this new and better covenant. You receive something. You receive what was promised long ago. It provides. This new and better covenant, this one, is what provides what the people had hoped for the ages. And again, the point is made then, right? Why would you go back? Why would you go back to this older covenant, the other one, when this new and better one provides you with the fulfillment of all that you had hoped for? Why would you go back? And so the third case is made. Now this last one, his final case, is going to have to do with the sacrifice that is offered by this better priest. And as fits the theme, you will see that the sacrifice is far superior than the other sacrifices. And again, this point gets blended in as he's coming to a close of his other point. Look at chapter 9, verse 12. He speaks here of his priesthood and the sacrifice that the priest offers. Chapter 9, verse 12. He says, he entered once for all into the holy places. This is speaking of Jesus and him as a priest. He enters once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood. This is going to be the sacrifice presented. By means of his own blood, now watch, thus securing an eternal redemption. And brethren, this point right here is going to be the key argument for the author with regards to what makes his sacrifice a better sacrifice. It secures an eternal redemption. The other sacrifices were not eternal. Their efficacy was temporary. It could never make perfect the one who offered it. There was always a need of another sacrifice and another sacrifice and another one so that they could continue to deal with sin. Notice what the author is going to say here in chapter 10. Look at with me verses 1 through 4. He says, since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities. Now notice what he's going to say. It can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered? Since the worshippers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sins. But in these sacrifices, there is a reminder of sins every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Now, brethren, you have to notice the point being made. The failure of these sacrifices is not that they did nothing in regards to sin. That's not the failure presented here. It's not that they did absolutely nothing in regards to sin. He actually says here in verse 2 of chapter 10 that the worshipers are cleansed by this sacrifice. But the problem is, it's temporary. It's a temporary cleansing. More sin means more necessity for cleansing. And in that sense, when he says here, it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins, brethren, this is the idea. It is impossible for that to eternally take away sin. Again, his point has to do with this better sacrifice offers an eternal redemption, not a temporary one. It is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin in a totality sense. And a better sacrifice is needed for that. And this is exactly the sacrifice that is put forth for us. Look at the argument here. Go back into chapter 9, verses 24 through 26. Here's what he says. For Christ, the Messiah, has entered not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Now, notice again, what is going to be said about this sacrifice? What is the distinction about it versus the other sacrifices? Verse 25, nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy places every year with blood not his own. For then he would have to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Brethren, this is the greatness of this better sacrifice. It's a once-for-all type of sacrifice. It's the kind of sacrifice that really puts away sin for good. It doesn't need to happen again and again and again. He goes on to say in chapter 10, verse 14, for by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. Brethren, one sacrifice brings perfection. This could not happen with the old covenant sacrifices. And this is the great distinction. This is what makes this sacrifice so much better. Eternal redemption never has to be offered again. If you could tell a Jew in the first century, or even before that, hey, one day there's only going to be one sacrifice made, and you never have to come back to the temple again. Your sacrifice or your sins are going to be totally dealt with. You never have to offer another sacrifice. Brethren, that would have been radical thought. And this is the glory of this sacrifice. This is what's being presented to these Christians. Why return to the old covenant sacrifices where there is no true forgiveness of sins? Why go back where the reminder of sins is unrelenting? And the necessity for continued sacrifice is daily. Because with God's Son, this Messiah, this greater high priest, who mediates a better covenant, brethren, there is a sacrifice that is offered that can fully and eternally reconcile people to their God. And so with all this exalted theology concerning Jesus, the author draws a conclusion of all of this. And Manny actually read it for us in the beginning. I want you to see it real quick as we close here. Chapter 10, notice what he says in 19 through 23. This is the conclusion of all this glorious theology concerning Jesus. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus. So here's the sacrifice, right? We have confidence to enter by the blood of Jesus, a better sacrifice, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. Since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Brethren, this is the conclusion of all the glorious theology that has been put forth concerning Jesus. Brethren, I hope that you can agree with this conclusion. That if this is what we have with the Lord Jesus, we have something better than we could ever imagine. We have something worthy of abiding in. There's a continued statement made throughout Hebrews. It is, consider Jesus. It comes out in chapter 3, verse 1. Comes out again in the beginning of chapter 12. Brother, this is what I want our focus to be over the next few weeks as we consider these arguments concerning Jesus in more detail. That we would consider Jesus. To consider just how worthy he is as God's unique Son, as a greater high priest who really stands as a mediator for the people, as a mediator of a new and better covenant, which really brings you all the things promised, and as a better sacrifice who can truly put away our sin before God. Brethren, this Jesus of the book of Hebrews is a glorious Jesus. Let's pray.